All right, welcome back to our series of how to set up and design letters in Adobe InDesign for Intro to Typography. If you haven't seen the previous videos to this, we have one on document setup, designing a letter H, and designing a letter D. And I encourage you to use those first so that you can have a firm understanding of some of the basic tools we'll be using here. In this video, we'll be designing a letter H. A letter S. And S is notoriously one of the hardest letters to get looking right. So no guarantees that what we get here is going to look perfect. But I do want to show you a little bit of methodology for how you might get through designing a letter S. So I've got the letter D here from the last video. I'm just going to lock it and hide it, just like I did with the letter H. And so for the letter S, the letter S is difficult because it has very few things that are certain about it, right? You can't draw a vertical line on the side and say, oh, good, that's half the letter, like you can with K or H. There are a bunch of curves, and you might think you can say, oh, yeah, we'll just divide the space in half and do two semicircles. Well, that doesn't look right. I won't even go through doing that because it's really a terrible way to get the letter S. So one of the things that you can do to sort of prompt yourself for designing a letter S is actually look at a few other letter S's first and look with a critical eye. So we have a few lowercase s's here, minuscules. So let's take a quick look at these and just see what we're dealing with. So if you get looking really close, obviously this is not a semicircle and this is not a semicircle, right? We've got lots of different curves going on here and very little that's anchored and aligned and straight and perfect. In fact, if we draw some guides here, you'll see very quickly, oh, I need a new layer. You'll see very quickly that pretty much nothing aligns. Like the apex of that S curve doesn't align with the end of the stroke at the bottom there. Nothing aligns in the middle, and likewise the edge out here doesn't align with anything really at all. So there's no hard and fast alignment that we're dealing with here. And in fact, if you look at the places that these terminals happen in the course of the apex, like here or here, they're very different, right? This ends a lot sooner in the stroke, way back in here, and this one ends way out almost at the apex. So that means that the entire letter S is kind of leaning forward, right? Leaning back by this measurement. It's that this is actually shorter. So the top section is smaller and the bottom section is bigger, making it feel more stable. So that's one of those optical corrections, but it's also just a design decision of the letter S. And we'll notice that nothing really gets vertical, nothing really gets horizontal, so you can't work from straight lines, right? Your closest to vertical is like here and here, and your closest to horizontal are here and here, and then you have something in between, and who knows exactly what angle this needs to be. You could go almost perfectly horizontal here, or almost still very vertical. It has to be some diagonal. But there are lots of unknowns about a letter S. So the question is, how do we design a letter S? You have to start somewhere, right? So I tend to start by designing the spine of an S, this part, and then I come back through and I add the top and bottom terminals, the ends of the S. And I find that works well because the spine is sort of the essence of the S. It's the piece that is going to look really wrong and that you're going to battle the most. And so I much prefer to design the part that's going to be hard, make sure that that's decent, and then add the easier parts later. So it's a very different letter, as you'll see as we get into the process. So with a letter S, I like to keep the stroke direction the same as if I were writing it. So I write a letter S from the top down to the bottom. I'm sure someone writes it differently, but whatever. So I'm going to start by designing a spine that goes from the top to the bottom. But then I need to come back through and actually add pieces to my stroke that are the top and the bottom, and those are going to have to comply with the same direction of the stroke, right? Because you can't join two strokes that are moving in opposite directions. You can reverse their stroke, but we'll get there. So let's go ahead and start with the pen tool here. We know that at some point in the apex of the curve of the top left side of this S, our stroke is going to reach a vertical. We're not going to use X height or cross height or anything like that to dictate exactly where this is going to happen. And in fact, we don't even have the benefit of using the cap height or the baseline exactly when we design an S because they're going to overshoot. They're curves. really nothing fits into a box about an S here. So let's just start out here in the blue. I'm going to start a path, and I'm going to hit Shift after I've clicked to constrain my proportions of my handles, or not proportions, directions of my handles. And I'm just going to guess. That's about the size I think I need. And then maybe I'm going to have another one that's like out over here. I think I'm wrong already, but let's fix things in a second here, right? Okay, so I'm going to drag that to be a similar handle proportion to the first one, because I know that both of these curves tend to be about the same in an S. All right. I'm going to go ahead and switch my styling here so that I actually have a stroke to deal with. And I'm going to add stroke weight so that I get a good sense of what my spine is going to look like. Now, it's only sort of a good sense, right? Like, it's not perfect here. There are some weird things happening on the ends that are not what I'm going to want in the end, but that's what I've got for now. So you notice that I put a point at the leftmost extrema and the rightmost extrema. And I broke a rule here, right? In the last video, I told you never cross your handles. And these are straight up crossing over a midpoint line, right? And I have two curves. I have one curve here, and I have another curve here. So this is actually one of those cases that now that we've designed a rule, we're going to break it. Having a spine that's nice and fluid actually depends on having very few controls into creating that line. So having two handles here will create a nice fluid spine to this S. If we added another point in the middle, we'd have to deal with how far we drag that horizontally each way, and we'd have to deal with the fact that that point, at some point, the line gets perfectly horizontal, which isn't true to our letter form here. So we would have to have a point that has handles that go diagonally, and then we'd have to try and decide what that diagonal angle is, and it just gets messy. So having just these two handles actually cleans things up and makes life a little bit easier. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and continue and work on the bottom of this S, because that's where I'm going next anyway. And I know that my stroke is going to be 15 points thick, and that I'm not actually going to get all the way to the baseline with it, right? So I'm going to pick roughly a center here, and roughly where I think the 7.5 points of stroke is going to land, and I'm snapping here to baseline, but I think it's going to be about like this. And then I'm going to drag points that continue the same direction of my line, and those handles are going to be constrained to horizontal directions again, so that I have nice control over the curve of my line. It looks ugly, right? But we'll fix it, don't worry. So I've dragged it here, and now I've got the bottom of my S, and I know from looking at these other S's that it tends to turn up on the ends just a little bit. So I'm going to do this, and I'm just going to, for now, drag two handles out, which is going to look ugly. But and then after I've dragged one, I'm going to hit Alt, and then that allows me to change just the second half of these handles. And I'll drag that back to its parent point. Oh, it's not snapping in, so I'll have to do this with an edit. I'll do the direct select tool, and I'll drag the handle back in, because I don't actually want any control past that. So that gives me control over this curve, control over this curve, control over the spine, and then I'll build something up here on the top. So I'm going to go back to my pen tool, and I'm just going to guess as to where the top will be. And remember that it's not going to be quite as far as this one, so I'm going to start back in here somewhere. And I'm going to work at an angle, which normally I don't like to work at angles, but again, the terminals of these S's are not at straight or horizontal angles. I mean, they can be if you want them to be, but that's up to you. And then I'm going to drag a constrained set of handles on the top here, and I'm going to drag it down to this anchor point, and guess, yeah, I'll use the same angle there. Okay, so I've got a pretty wonky looking S right now, right? But I have all the right pieces in all the right places. All the points are in the right spots. So I have the right bones to work with. It's just that they need a little bit of positional adjustment. It's like a chiropractor job now, right? So I can go ahead and move this up a little bit. This is just eyeballing it, right? You just have to kind of guess, what does an S really look like? And that actually looks like it might be low enough already. I'm not sure. Maybe let's bring this down just a little. And this crease is bad, so to alleviate that, I'm going to raise this handle up. Again, I'm holding Shift to constrain proportions, and I'm going to lower this handle down to ease this one. So now we're looking at maybe a slightly better spine. I still don't like how that's pinched there a little bit, so I'm going to move this point up just a little bit here. And you'll notice that this is boxing out a little bit. That's because, look, this handle is almost crossing where this handle would go if it were extended, so I'm going to bring it down so that these feel a little closer to equal. All right, so now we're starting to smooth out here a little bit, and we're still pinched down here. So I'm going to move this down. All right, it's maybe a little too far. I'm going to just nudge it up a little bit here, just right in there. I'm going to move this handle up. So you'll notice that this spine actually still is not horizontal, and it's like maybe a 20-degree add from horizontal. So you don't necessarily want to get to straight horizontal here. You do want some sort of an angle cutting through the middle, some weird diagonal. So you'll notice that this handle hasn't really been pulled out very far in comparison to this one. Like if they're racing to the corner, this one's winning, right? So we want to back that off just a little bit, and we want to add this in just a little bit. That'll ensure that you have a nice gradual curve, so that so the letter feels somewhat natural. Now this one feels like it's kind of trailing down in the bottom left corner of the letter, right? So this anchor, I'm actually going to just move up a little bit. And this point, you'll notice if I grab this anchor, it's pulled less to the left side than it is to the right side. So that's an indication to me that I can create a little bit better balance by moving the anchor point over a little to the right, moving the handle in, and then moving this handle out. So that ensures that the curve on the bottom here is going to feel like a nice even curve. So that's what I was trying to get at there. Now, if you'll notice, this S feels like it's sort of just falling back a little bit. So this gets into some more finessed adjustments of S's. So I'm going to go ahead and take this anchor point and just nudge it to the right just a little bit, because my goal is to make both the top of the S feel a little bit smaller than the bottom of the S, so it's stable, but also make it not feel like it's falling over backwards. So I need to move the top to the right and maybe the bottom to the left, we'll see. So I'm going to nudge this anchor over, maybe this one a little bit more. Yeah, that's feeling okay. Maybe just that a little bit more. Oh yeah, that's feeling balanced. So now you'll notice that there are some interesting visual things going on with this letter form. I'm going to go ahead and grab this and switch it to black so that it's a little closer to what we'd see on a page. Yeah, so if we look at this S, there are some weird visual things going on. We have a pretty decent curve structure to it, but there are places in the S that feel too heavy and they feel too thin in other places. So for example, you'll notice that right in here it feels really heavy. And then right over here, it feels pretty thin. And likewise, this one feels thin, this feels heavy, and the spine itself feels pretty heavy. Well, part of this is because of optical corrections. Our eyes are used to seeing horizontal lines be corrected to be thinner, and this is basically a horizontal line. It's not quite, but so this is feeling too thick. And this vertical line over here is feeling too thin. Well, that's exactly what we'd expect to see. And then this near horizontal line in the middle is feeling too thick. Yep, okay. And then same thing happens on the bottom, right? So we can't really adjust this if we're just using the stroke on our letter of 15 points. So we're going to need to adjust that to make our S even look right. This isn't even in the realm of like, oh, it's not optically corrected, so it's not like finessed. This S looks wrong still. So we're going to open this up. We have the one path right now. And I'm going to select that. I'm going to copy it and paste it in front of itself. We're going to save this spine so that we're saving the path in case we need to edit its form. And we're going to lock it and hide it. And we're going to edit this one. Well, our next step, if we need to edit the outsides of this letter, would be Object, Path, Outline Stroke. Seen that before. And now, if we get looking, because we designed with a good spine of the letter, we actually have a lot of really nicely placed sister points. So you can imagine if you weren't thinking about the spine, it might be really tempting to get in here and add points and push things around just a little bit to adjust this letter S. But you're adding controls. Every time you add a point on a slant somewhere or in some weird place, you're adding a control. And that makes your life harder because that's more factors that you have to deal with to get them all in line to look nice. So it's really great that we ended up with these two sister points, these two sister points, these ones, the spine sister points, which were created for us, and then these, same thing on the bottom. The spine sister points, we didn't create these points, but Illustrator noticed that we had a curve that went from here to here, and then another curve that went from here to here. Remember how we created two curves by having lines that went past each other? Well, we broke one of our rules, but Illustrator noticed, hey, I can fix that for them by putting nice sister points right here, right where the transition happens. So we got those out of the process for free. Yay. So if we were going to adjust this letter, which we will, we're going to just nudge these so that they're slightly thinner. Now, before we do any of this, we actually have a problem because I didn't notice we overshot by more on the top than we did on the bottom here. So it's a really small problem to fix because we can just select the letter and move it down slightly so that the overshoot is roughly the same, and then we're probably in good shape again. It might actually take going back to the spine editing version of the letter here and adjusting so that the exact size works for how much overshoot we want on the top and the bottom. But in this case, we had enough that it's just about right on top and bottom. So we're going to come back and select the letter. I like where the overshoot points are on the top and bottom. So in order to thin these strokes, I'm just going to nudge the inner parts of the sister point pairs out so that they're nice and thin here, right? Now, obviously we've edited the profile of this stroke, but we're doing it for optical correction's sake to make sure that this looks okay. And we noticed that it was kind of too thin here, so we're going to do the same thing and just bump in from the outsides, right? And actually by bumping these to be a little bit thicker and bumping these to be a little bit thinner, the spine starts to feel pretty okay. I'm not going to mess with these spine points, especially because they're not on vertical or horizontal extrema, so I have nothing to move them perfectly vertical or horizontal in relation to. So having them sit right there is kind of nice. I kind of lucked out in this case. If you really wanted to get persnickety about this, you might consider giving yourself a guide shape or an angled guide, if you can do something like that in Illustrator, that runs through both of these points, and then you could very easily adjust them in or out along that line. Right? So an example of that would be like take a rectangle here as your guide shape, and then rotate it so that it runs. Grab everything here. Come on. Rotate it so that it runs through both of those points. And now, when you adjust these points, you can actually adjust. You can actually adjust them along. Oh, come on! You can actually adjust them along this path. If I could use my keyboard. Right? You'd adjust them along that path, and you would know that they're along the same line. I'm not going to do that because I actually don't feel like I need any adjustments on the spine of this S. But here we go. We have a letter S, and it actually turned out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with this S. It feels balanced. It feels like it's not falling over one way or the other. It feels like it's about the right stroke weight, and the curves feel pretty fluid on it. The only thing I think still that feels a little bit wrong about this S is that it feels a little bit like it's too wide. So I'm going to just select the entire S, and I'm going to just hold out and make a slight adjustment to make it a little bit thinner. Normally, you would want to make sure that you go back to your spine version of the letter before you make any skewing adjustments like that, because when you do that, you're adjusting the implicit widths and heights of these strokes. And I know that all of my strokes are slightly adjusted anyway, so I'm not really tied to having them be exactly 15 points thick. So that's why I did the skew transformation to a small amount without really worrying about what it did to the spine. If you had any larger adjustments than that, you might want to consider going back to the spine and making those adjustments to the spine, then extruding and creating shapes and doing all your adjustments again, just to make sure that that worked out. So now I've got a letter S. I still need to create a space block for this X, or for this S. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the one from the D, just kind of stay in the same vein of consistency here. Copy and paste is your friend, right? And I'll copy this one, I'll paste it, I'm going to just drag it up into the S layer here, and that'll keep it. I used Command F to paste in front, which kept its position, and I'm going to lock all of my D layers up here and hide D again. Okay, so now I'm back on S. I have my preserved path. I have a rectangle that is the space for the S, and I have the S itself. And instead of moving the space box over to the S, I'm going to move the S to the space box because I want it to be roughly aligned with the other letters. Again, doesn't really matter, but I'm just doing it for staying organized. So you'll notice here that if I look at this space box in comparison to like the D has about that same amount of space that we would have from like the H on the left side, and then a reduced space on the right side. That was in the last video. But the letter S is sort of a different beast, yet again, right? We don't necessarily have a straight line like this for the H or the D to go off of, so we don't want that much space to the left of it. But we also don't have this big curved out bowl like a D has here. So we're going to have to split the difference probably is what's going to need to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the D again and bring the S layer back. And I'll grab the rectangle here. And I'm just going to hold Alt to edit both at the same time because I was close to centered up. And I'm just going to split the difference. I don't have quite as much space here as I had to the left of the D or the H. But I do have a little bit of space, and it feels fairly comfortable for this S. The S doesn't have any large gaping areas of white space, just a little bit here and a little bit here. So I don't think we're going to run into any big problems as far as letters feeling like they're floating too far away from this letter S. So here's the space box that I'm going to choose for this letter S. Again, you'd probably lock your layer, and then you can move on to your next letter. So that's my process for designing a letter S. Hope it was helpful. Hope it gets you through your letter S somewhat pain-free. Stick with me for the next video. I'm going to cover some punctuation and how those can be reusing shapes and a little bit on type DNA. Here comes another one.